Welcome to the 1 in 5 podcast. I am your host, Priya, and this is my good friend, RJ. We've known each other for a really long time, since elementary school. We were in the same
Second grade class.
second grade class. Would you like to take a moment to speak to why you're passionate about mental health?
Yeah, so I've had the pleasure of, being kind of sheltered from a lot of the issues that have been going on with mental health in like really anywhere in the world, but particularly in my family. There's a lot of depression on both sides, some bipolar on my dad's side. But one of the biggest issues is it's so rarely talked about on either side, particularly in my dad's. It's such a stigmatized issue that we really don't talk about at all. If someone gets diagnosed or if someone's undergoing treatment, we largely stay silent about it. So I think it's so important to me to be open and to communicate very honestly and clearly about these issues. I want to break that generational cycle of having unresolved mental health issues. And I think the best way to do that is through mediums like these. July is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And surprise, surprise, we're both minorities.
In the country that we live in, which is America.
America.
But I think that there's a lot we're gonna try and cover in this episode. We're gonna be primarily talking to the first two generations of immigrant children.
There's a lot that we can bring to the table and speak on both the research we've done and our own personal experiences, with me being a third generation immigrant and Priya being a second generation. So
One thing that we are sad about, but that we will definitely be covering later on, is that we simply do not have enough time in this episode to cover the immigrant experience, because that is a very large and nuanced topic that we definitely want to dedicate the appropriate amount of time to.
let's talk about Pokemon. I know Priya is a very dedicated Pokemon fan, with it sounds like her family being
Ooh,
much more
people will be
diehard.
mad at you for saying that. I haven't even played Heart Gold and Soul Silver, bro.
But let's be honest, the real way that makes you a Pokemon fan, the TV show.
Though watching the anime, and I
So
have
iconic.
watched the
Even
anime.
though Ash has never aged. Who is your favorite? Who are your favorite characters from the Pokemon show?
Team Rocket
Prepare for trouble.
and Naked Devil.
Meowth, that's right. We're talking about Double Trouble.
There's a sort of double trouble difficulty when you're a minority battling with mental health issues. Because not only are societal and cultural stigmas working against you, but also discrimination, racism, colorism, hate crimes, and the list definitely goes on.
Absolutely.
But my point being is that it definitely takes a toll on your mental health. And so one example we see of this is in events like the 2014 Ferguson unrest, which was, and I'm gonna be honest, I'm quoting from Wikipedia because I didn't want to mess up any of the information. The Ferguson riots were a series of protests and riots, which began in Ferguson, Missouri on August 10th, 2014, the day after the fatal shooting of Michael Brown by FPD officer Darren Wilson. And the unrest sparked a vigorous debate in the United States about the relationship between law enforcement officers and Black Americans, the militarization of police, and the use of force law in Missouri and nationwide.
I think a good way, if maybe you don't like know as much about this issue, more or sort of comparable issue, is what happened in 2020 with the death of George Floyd. I think that has a similar amount of feelings with the amount of civil unrest and the disproportionate effect that uh, the police officers have on Black Americans. So
Yeah. And I mean, both you and I lived through that,
right,
even though we were definitely very young at the time, but I feel like even being very young, you do kind of notice there was definitely a shift in the atmosphere with how publicized and widespread, both through protests and through the media, this event was. It really did impact all communities across America. And because of how infamous it is, it definitely qualifies as a collective trauma, which refers to, and I quote from this paper, we determined that the dot was up there. Collective trauma refers to, I quote, large scale community events experienced directly and indirectly, end quote. So things as personal as your engagement and in protesting, or as integral to your being as your racial identity, or even something as indirect as seeing something about the events on social media can impact your mental health. And generally, those with more exposure to the event had a higher risk of experiencing negative mental health symptoms, whether that be by seeing a lot about it online or by being personally involved in the incidents. Obviously, direct exposure is more impactful because obviously it's going to hit you a lot harder seeing something in person than seeing it on a screen. But don't discount the damage that continuous indirect exposure can do. Like, one thing I know that me and a couple of my friends have talked about, I'm sure you've talked about this with your friends too. Not that we're not friends, we are friends, but I digress. Is kind of how big of a negative toll, even just looking at the news a lot, because, there's a lot going on in the world at all times, and usually the news is about really negative things. Kind of always looking at that and internalizing it and thinking about it does have a negative impact on your mental health. So again, don't discount the impact that indirect exposure can have on you. And furthermore, more relating back to the Ferguson unrest, there's the idea of police brutality and violence to draw up here, which, on kind of a wider lens and given the numerous incidents which have occurred, have also taken a major toll on young Black individuals, according to a study from WashU. The study basically says that among young Black individuals, the direct or indirect exposure to police brutality has caused rising anxiety levels in these young Black people. Although there are some other factors involved, which were socio-demographic and community violence factors, which were in play as well. And like these indirect and direct experiences, some direct experiences were like being the victim of police brutality, witnessing it happen in action, having somebody, um, get severely hurt in one of those incidences. And then some of the indirect experiences were having somebody be impacted by those events, seeing it on social media, living in a community where it's widespread and known about. That's just one example of how community events can impact your mental health and how discrimination, racism, colorism, hate crimes can impact your
Absolutely.
mental health.
So going on from there, I think there's also one pretty major community event that everyone can remember, which is the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. I certainly remember it. And I know there's a lot, we talk a lot about how mental health generally went in decline for everybody around that time being in quarantine. But one group that we want to focus on is Asians, particularly the Chinese and Asian hate crimes. So, I mean, this discrimination dates back to the 19th century. There's been a very long historical prejudice against Chinese individuals being perpetual foreigners or disease spreaders. And these biases, while largely like undercurrent and very subtle but influencing, revealed themselves in a much more harsh light during the pandemic. I know there's a large rise in Asian violence or hate crimes against Asians. I believe it was about 149% in the year 2021, which is insane. Uh, and not just Chinese people, but other Asians, people of East Asian descent. I don't know if you guys remember the spa shootings on March 16th of 2021. This event in particular actually put a lot of light on the anti-Asian sentiment going on in the United States. You know, the violence acting on that sentiment, so many different hate crimes and different attacks. This could cause a lot of increase in anxiety for the Asian population all across the United States. They had a lot of anxiety, depression, trouble sleeping in these targeted groups. So a lot of us need to consider how these Asian and Pacific Islander groups are the least likely to reach out for mental health too. Part of that is due to the stigma, I think much more so than the culture, I would say too.
Yeah,
There's
there's
so much,
definitely a lot of stigma.
there's lots and lots of stigma. And I think the more that we are focused on that light, on how it's okay for everybody in the United States to get that, we can understand that these symptoms that they may have experienced, particularly during the pandemic, and how they were only uh, they only were able to grow based on their disinclination to these mental health services.
Kind of just jumping back to, the Pokemon reference, because I was very proud of the Pokemon reference. Um, the double trouble difficulty. We're gonna extend on that idea and make it into a triple trouble difficulty because minorities also face this barrier of getting the aid and access to help that they need because
Well, I think one of the most highlighted issues is how so many institutions and programs lack a certain level of cultural understanding. I know you're going to talk a little bit more in this Eurocentric version of a lot of these institutions, particularly in medicine, psychiatry. But this changes the perception of how mental health is maybe perceived, understanding these cultural sensitivities on how some people might react to different behaviors, the overall impact of like all these events of people not being able to understand is that they just don't reach this audience, which further marginalizes them. I was talking with Priya earlier. I think a great example is how eczema was so heavily misdiagnosed and still is today because of this lack of cultural focus. So if you look up eczema charts, I'm sure you can look them up right now, and you see so many of these photos of people with white skin, and it's much that you see so many charts on maybe the redness around their elbows areas and their face and how easily that is able to see with just one chart. But if you're looking at someone with more melanated skin, you see much fewer charts. So maybe people, if they see the bumps and rashes on your skin, they might not be able to easily diagnose it as eczema because of this lack of cultural understanding of people different from them.
yeah, and again, he kind of jumps into this with that example, but historically, a lot of these fields, medicine in general, but also because we're specifically talking about psychology and psychiatry, they've historically been very Eurocentric. Basically during their foundational years and even up to like as late as the 2000s, they revolved around white people and therefore do have a certain level of inaccuracy when diagnosing minorities. And one example was something I found in this article. This article was about how, or this example in the article was about how a lot of the tools used to diagnose individuals are, again, based on this research that was very centered around white people. And it references how a lot of the time that causes them to sometimes misdiagnose minorities or suggest the existence of a diagnosis without just enough cause. And so I'm gonna give an example for another example of the example from the paper. Um, it was in this example, they were talking about how some Black individuals, when they were being assessed for mental health conditions, exhibited symptoms of distrust and paranoia, and a lot of them ended up being diagnosed with psychosis disorder, which is characterized as a mental disorder causing a disconnect from reality. And there wasn't quite enough in the paper, in my opinion, to say for sure whether these individuals actually had psychosis disorder or not. But the one thing the paper did do was put it into the cultural context and kind of look at the full picture. And in this case, when you put the symptoms of distrust and paranoia into the cultural context of Black people in America, you're obviously going to see there's a good chance that those symptoms have been caused by things like the hate crimes, the discrimination, the police brutality, the racism that they've experiencing for such a long time. And so that kind of just goes to show that really linking back to those cultural experiences is super important because it might show you that there's a misdiagnosis or no diagnosis at all, or it might show us that there is a diagnosis, but that there is a clear causality to that diagnosis, and that there are steps that you could take to prevent that mental illness or disorder from developing in the future and in future generations. So again, we're not going to be talking about the immigrant experience in this episode just because again very large nuanced subject, we
Absolutely.
don't want to try and shorten it down just to fit it into this episode, but one thing we will talk about in this episode is our experience.
I know we were talking a lot about earlier about the struggles of how like so many immigrants face, in this um coming into a new country with nothing. And we're not going to delve super deep into that. But we are going to dive into how many or how it affects their descendants or their children. So there's this one written in the National Institute of Health, which is talking about something called sense of indebtedness towards parents, or SIP. So we found this quote that says, Sense of indebtedness towards parents, otherwise known as SIP, refers to feelings of debt to give back to parents for their migration-related sacrifices in second-generation immigrants. So essentially, that means uh, recognizing all the sacrifices that maybe if you have an immigrant parent, recognizing all those sacrifices, you feel a certain level of guilt, like you need to pay them back for everything that they did to ensure that really you could have a better life.
Yeah, and I know I definitely relate to this on a lot of different levels. There's a big feeling of wanting to repay your parents for these sacrifices. Um, because being second generation kids and when hearing about like our parents' stories, which are often of like suffering or facing barriers which luckily we don't have to face, we tend to think about how lucky we are to be in the positions that we are in and how we really ought to make the most of our opportunities. Um, and I came across this thing that was called the indebtedness theory. And the indebtedness theory, this is a quote, by the way, from this source. Quote, the indebtedness theory assumes that the degree of sense of indebtedness depends on the extent of the costs incurred by the donor. And so in this sense, our parents would be the donor and the costs they would be taking on is, the process of immigrating, um, really breaking away, abandoning pretty much everything they've ever known, their family, their culture, even sometimes like in my family's case, our language, and taking on an entirely different role in society, often being in a different social or economic status, sacrificing their dreams and ambitions in favor of jobs that enable them to get to these new places. And all of these costs are often not lost on the next generations. So I think that we're gonna jump to the questions now. How much do your parents know about their parents?
Yeah, so with my parents, my dad in particular, I'm mixed race. So that's a whole other like episode on, mixed identity and everything. But
We'll get you back on for that one.
for my grandparents' experience in particular, they went through a very tough time. I know my grandma or my Lola was raised particularly wealthy. Their family were war profiteers during World War II, but her mom died when she was about 11 from tuberculosis. Her dad not much later, so she through most of her teen years, she actually lived in somewhat poverty, with only being raised by her older siblings, some of which who got killed or lost at sea or tortured. So she's talked a lot about how hard that was living such a privileged life as a younger child to go from there. My Lolo or grandpa's story is much more tame. They come from a little more of like a suburban area. Um, and I never got to know him since he passed before I was born. But they got married shortly before departing from the Philippines, and going off of that, they had to experience so many different cultures because they moved primarily for a job. Um, I believe they only knew some English because they do speak English in the Philippines, but much less. Um, my Lola couldn't find a job because she was Filipino, and in our area, it was still fairly conservative and hard to do that. So my dad had a was lucky to he felt always told me he felt very guilty and lucky he didn't have to experience any of that. The most he experienced was there was a lot of racism injected on him. I don't know if any like minorities know the question like, but where are you really from?
Oh, yeah.
He would get that a lot. So I think that's a very important question, and I really like talking about their experience and how it was able to develop me. How about you?
So honestly, I don't know how much I want to share
Mhm.
about my mom because honestly, I only really started finding out about her past after she passed away. When she was living, she was very like kind of not necessarily closed off, but she would just, and this is kind of a thing with both of my parents, like they never really want to talk about like how they grew up because both of them grew up in pretty difficult circumstances. Like, I think I'll talk about my dad first because my mom's is again A
Right.
little bit more hard hitting. My dad basically grew up in like poverty, in Chennai, and I think he spent some time in Chennai and some time in Kerala. But my parents are both from Kerala originally, and basically, like, he just had to like study and study and study and study and study to get out of there,
Yeah, I
which
bet.
I'm sure you've heard about too.
Yep.
um,
Yeah, there's a lot of history of studying.
yeah,
Of
there's a lot of
studying.
history there. And he likes to tell this story to us about how he would like tie himself down to a chair on the terrace and study for 14 hours straight every day. I feel like people are always talking about how much I study, so if anybody's wondering where I get it from, it's that man. And yeah, because he was pretty much living in poverty, he and his siblings realized pretty young, okay, if we want to get out of this situation, we really have to like work and work and work. And luckily they were all able to do that. And his brothers live in England now, and my dad lives here, obviously. Um um and then for my mom, she had definitely a much rougher go of it. Basically, her parents traveled around a lot,
Mhm.
and I actually genuinely have no clue what they do or did. Um, but I think, but my mom, because her parents moved around a lot of the time, she was put in boarding school in an area in Africa, I believe, which
Wow.
I again did not know until like just last year. From like the age of like very, very young, like I think like 6 or 7. And because she had two younger siblings, she was the oldest child. She had two younger siblings, and she pretty much had to take care of them a lot of the time. She would like make their lunches for them. And she really, really loved them so much. So I know she took great care of them. But the other thing is that she got like very severely sick um when she was there. Probably in part because she had a lot of responsibility on her, but she like nearly died twice, two different occasions
Wow.
actually, and she was nearly almost like not able to have kids, which would suck for me personally because I wouldn't be here. So yeah, she nearly died twice when she was at boarding school, and her parents were actually unable to come see her both times. So
Wow.
very rough go of it. And then she went back to India and went into med school and was taking care of her parents at the time. So you'll see a common theme here is that she's kind of always taking care of somebody. And then she was kind of at a point in her life where she really wanted to go like travel and explore and really like I kind of like I guess what in America like would be the equivalent of like living in your mid-20s, which she was like in her
Yeah.
mid-20s at the time. But the thing is that she lived in this kind of culture where like she had a younger sister who was like just a year younger than her. And the thing was that her parents were telling her, if you don't get married now, you're not going to be able to get married because we're going to have to move on to marrying off your sister because we don't want her to wait forever. And basically, if we marry her off first, you're going to be like a spinster. And that's like very like taboo in India. Basically, she and my dad had an arranged marriage. Um, which the story of how they got married is definitely kind of crazy because they like talked for 15 minutes beforehand and
Wow. That's it.
then got married. Both great people, both lovely people, lovely parents. Didn't get along great. So they ended up getting divorced when I was about 5. Um, and then about 2 years after that, my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and then she passed away. So yeah, she definitely had a much rougher go of it. How do you feel the knowledge of what your parents have been through has stuck with you throughout the years?
Um, for me personally, it's very interesting as an experience. I'm mixed race. So hearing about all these experiences in a wildly different culture that I've been through has really helped me sort of realize my identity because like I've spent so much time with, my Lola on on my dad's side, and then like my grandma who passed away recently on my mom's side. No, it's a distinct balance of cultures for me, being able to like I don't know. I didn't know whether or not I was, should be considered Filipino or just American. I was kind of lost at that point. So one of those ways, especially during COVID, for me to fully realize my identity was to talk to my Lola. I heard all about her stories, how she kind of slayed in high school. Like she was the captain of three different
Wait,
sports
oh,
teams.
that's what I remember my mom, like we found when we were cleaning out her house after she passed away,
Mhm.
we found like letters and of like her teachers and we were like, Nirmala is an excellent student. So I'm sorry, I totally
That's
interrupted
okay.
you.
That's okay.
Continue.
And like how my great aunt, was is being considered for sainthood. But yeah, I think being able to hear about all these stories, and of course there's some on my mom's side. Like I like hearing about all the experience of how my grandparents met on that side. But I don't go into it as much because it's a little bit more of a normalized type of culture, primarily because they are Caucasian. So hearing about this totally different side that I come from has really helped me shape who I am and who I can consider myself to be.
Mm,
So how
that's
about you?
that's awesome. For me, I feel like the knowledge of like how hard my dad has worked to get to where he is today, and even like how hard he works even now, and um also just a lot of what my mom went through and obviously grew up through, and what she, as she died like pretty young, kind of thinking about how much she sacrificed for us as well, kind of um has definitely stuck with me, honestly, in a lot of the ways, in like the guilt complex that we were talking
Yeah,
about, like in that unconscious
absolutely.
guilt way, and about how like again, I want to make sure that I'm making the most of the opportunities that I am given.
Mhm.
Um, so do you feel like this experience that your grandparents had is like a shared experience in any way?
I'm sure it is. I'm sure there's some sort of universal connection between immigrants who have to traverse through like so many trials and tribulations to get to the United States and all of those just different issues. So I think absolutely, I think to an extent they have their own unique experience, how they met, what they do nowadays. How about you? Do you feel like it's a shared experience?
I actually, it's a little bit complicated for me, I feel
I
like.
bet.
Um, I feel like it's definitely a shared experience in that, like, I think I'm interpreting this a little bit differently than you did. I feel like with other second generation immigrants I know, or even with like my siblings for one, or with um even other like third gen immigrants,
Hmm.
I think that there's definitely like a shared idea of like, okay, our parents or our grandparents have been through so much. We're really in a position where like we have so many more resources, opportunities, um,
Right.
chances to. I feel like there's a big emphasis on being successful. And we have a big chance to be more successful and making more money, and generally, because success is so often equated with happiness, be happier than our
Yeah,
parents
of
were,
course.
and they sacrificed so much to get us to this point where we can pursue those goals, and so we really need to take advantage of that. So I definitely do feel that like it is a shared experience, but I like that we're getting two different perspectives
Yeah.
on that question. I think that's great. What are some other ways, if any, you feel that the immigrant experience manifests itself in mental health?
For me, from what I've seen, it seems like a lot of immigrants go through such tremendous hardship and they end up dealing with a lot of unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with that. Like I know all the things that my grandma has gone through to make her way to the United States, and just her entire life story is just so captivating. But she almost rarely talked about it until she got older, and frankly, it was like didn't have as much left to lose. And I think that's such a dangerous thing to do too, to have to deal through all these completely traumatic experience, probably more traumatic than anything I might ever know in my life. And then keep that bottled in as maybe a sense of duty or protection to your children or experiences like that, I think is complete like that's one of the most common uh, responses to that trauma as an immigrant, and I've seen that in a lot of different like people that I know and my relatives who have all immigrated to from the United States or from other countries. So that's my takeaway. How about you?
I feel like pretty much the exact same way. Like, I think I mentioned earlier that I did not know a lot about my mom's childhood or my dad's really. I still don't know a lot about either of theirs when they were growing up, and I feel like in a way that it relates to mental health, like they very much so kept that hidden inside them. Like they really wanted in a lot of ways, I think, to kind of, especially my dad, I think more so than my mom, disconnect us from this culture that they themselves kind of deem to be not the most helpful to their experiences. I am Malayali and our language shockingly is Malayalam, and like I really wish that my parents had taught me that, but they didn't in a large part so that our English would be better and we'd have more opportunities because our English was better, rather than having us know two different languages, one of which they deemed was like not useful in this environment that they've given to us. So kind of like in a lot of ways that complete disconnect from their culture and their childhoods and kind of internalizing a lot of that was something that I really saw with my parents
Kind of
and
like we
still
talked about
see.
with psychosis, right? Like that disconnection from
Yeah.
reality. I think that's kind of a good way to connect it.
So we hope you enjoyed our question and answer kind of format. We hope that a lot of the information in this episode resonated with you. Um, he's gonna go bye-bye. Thank you so much, RJ, for joining
Thank
us.
you. This was a lot of fun.
So we really hope you enjoyed this episode. I know there was a lot in here, so leave any questions you have in the comments below. We're not professionals and we'll probably have to research into any comments you leave, but we will do our best to get back to you and let us know anything that you would like to talk about. It's really important to think about the fact that it's not like our being second and third generation immigrants. It's not our fault for what our parents or grandparents have gone through because the decisions and the choices they made to migrate and to come to wherever you are in the world were that so we could live not only successful but also happy lives and to have the chance to grow up in a different environment than they did. We really have no reason to blame ourselves for our parents or grandparents' pain and tribulations because it's not what they would have wanted anyways. And we're definitely not telling you to not work hard or to not make the most of your opportunities, but I think something that I do a lot of the time is I very much so, and this is pretty ironic, but I very much so have a lot of self-destructive tendencies from my like determination to make the most of my circumstances and kind of thinking of like the circumstances that my parents were in and how I really ought to um make well with what I have now because they didn't have it and I think that they would have done a great job if they had the circumstances that I have, but instead of focusing on just chasing that success aspect, um, with the resources that we've been given, we should also be working on chasing happiness because that is really the most valuable form of success. That form of success, being happy, is probably what you should really want for yourself or what your family really wants for you. So always remember, you don't have to put an unrealistic amount of pressure on yourself to justify your resources because your existence and what your parents have chosen to sacrifice and what your grandparents have chosen to sacrifice already justifies those opportunities. Just do your best and please remember to prioritize your mental health because that is the most important thing. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. We put a lot of time and effort into these. Okay, I'm going to end this now. Bye bye.